What happened to the Neanderthals? It's one of the biggest questions about our own past. For a long time, the story was simple. They were the classic cavemen. Big, brutish, maybe not too bright. They were an older, less advanced model of human, and then we, Homo sapiens, showed up. We were smarter, faster, better. We came out of Africa, spread across the world, and they just disappeared. We won. They lost. Extinction. The end. But what if that's not the whole story? What if it wasn't a simple replacement? The question is, did Neanderthals simply get absorbed by humans? Did they fade away not with a bang, but by blending into our own gene pool? The truth is, it's complicated. The simple story of us wiping them out is probably wrong. The simple story of them just peacefully merging with us is also probably wrong. What happened was a long, messy process. It involved competition, climate change, and yes, sex. To understand it, we have to throw out the old image of the dim-witted Neanderthal. We have to look at the hard evidence from bones and stones. And most importantly, we have to look at the evidence hidden inside our own DNA. The story starts with how we first saw them. When the first Neanderthal skeleton was found in Germany in the 1850s, scientists didn't know what to make of it. Some thought it was a deformed modern human, maybe a sick Russian soldier from the Napoleonic Wars. The bones were thick, the brow ridge was huge, it looked powerful but stooped. The scientists who first described it painted a picture of a beast. He thought it was too primitive to even speak properly. This image stuck. For 100 years, Neanderthals were our brutish, failed cousins. They were a dead end on the evolutionary tree. This view fit neatly with the out-of-Africa model of human origins. The idea was that our species, Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa around 200,000 to 300,000 years ago. We were the finished product. Then, around 60,000 years ago, a small group of us left Africa and began to spread across the globe. According to the strict version of this theory, we replaced every other kind of human we met. We didn't mix with them. We outcompeted them. We were just better. Neanderthals in Europe and Asia, Denisovans in Asia, and other archaic humans just couldn't keep up. They went extinct. Our success was their failure. For decades, this was the standard explanation. The archaeological evidence seemed to support it. When modern humans arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago, we see a change in the tools. The Neanderthals had their Mousterian toolkit. It was effective, but it didn't change much for over 100,000 years. Then modern humans arrived with their new technology, more complex stone blades, tools made from bone and antler, spear throwers that let them hunt from a safer distance. And soon after we show up in the fossil record, the Neanderthals start to disappear. The last of them seemed to vanish around 40,000 years ago. The timeline looked pretty clear. We arrive, they die out, it was easy to connect the dots and assume we caused it. But then, things started to get more complicated. Archaeologists started to look at Neanderthals more closely without the old prejudice. And they found that the brutish caveman stereotype was completely wrong. Neanderthals weren't stupid. Their brains were, on average, slightly larger than ours. Bigger doesn't automatically mean smarter, but it shows they weren't simple-minded apes. They were incredibly skilled hunters. They took down huge animals like mammoths and woolly rhinos. That's not something you do by just running at them with a pointy stick. It takes planning, cooperation, and a deep understanding of your environment and your prey. They knew how to control fire. They lived through multiple ice ages in some of the harshest environments imaginable. You don't survive that by being dumb. Their tools weren't primitive either. The Mousterian toolkit was versatile. They could make sharp flakes for cutting meat, scrapers for preparing animal hides, and points for their spears. They knew which rocks were best and where to find them. They were expert craftspeople. And in their later years, just before they disappeared, some Neanderthal groups started making more complex tools, some of which looked a lot like the ones made by modern humans. Were they copying us, or did they invent these new tools on their own? We still don't know for sure. But it shows they were capable of innovation, and there were hints of a rich inner life. We have found Neanderthal sites with evidence of pigment use. They seem to be using black and red minerals, maybe for body paint. They collected eagle talons and shells, which they might have worn as jewelry. These things suggest symbolic thought, the idea that something can stand for something else. This is the foundation of art, of language, of culture. They also buried their dead. It might not sound like much, but it's a big deal. Burying someone means you are not just leaving a body to be eaten by scavengers. It suggests you have some concept of an afterlife, or at least some sense of grief and respect for the deceased. At a site called Shanidar Cave in Iraq, a Neanderthal was buried with clumps of pollen around his body. For a long time, this was seen as proof of a flower burial. Maybe they laid him to rest on a bed of flowers. That interpretation is now debated. The pollen might have just been brought in by burrowing rodents. But other Neanderthal burials are less ambiguous. They were deliberately placed in graves. So, the picture changed. Neanderthals weren't evolutionary failures. They were a different kind of human. Successful, intelligent, and adaptable. They thrived in Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They weren't the lumbering brutes we imagined. They were our equals, or at least very close to it. This new understanding made the question of their disappearance even more puzzling. Well, if they were so capable, why did they vanish so quickly after we arrived? And if they were so much like us, was it really possible that we lived side by side for thousands of years and never interacted? Never mixed. Some fossils hinted that we did. For years, a few skeletons were found that seemed to have a mix of Neanderthal and modern human features. A child's skeleton from Portugal, a jawbone from a cave in Romania, these were controversial. Skeptics argued you could explain the features in other ways. They were intriguing clues, but they weren't definitive proof. The debate was stuck. We had two groups of humans. One disappeared, the other took over. Did they fight? Did they make love? Or did they just ignore each other until one group died out? The bones and stones could only tell us so much. The real breakthrough came from a place no one expected. It came from the dust inside old bones. It came from genetics. In the late 1990s, a team led by a scientist named Svante Pääbo managed to do something incredible. They extracted a tiny piece of mitochondrial DNA from the very first Neanderthal skeleton ever found. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down only from the mother. It's a small part of our genetic code, but it's a start. When they compared the Neanderthal DNA to ours, it was very different. It seemed to confirm the old story. They were a separate lineage. They split from our ancestors a long time ago, maybe 500,000 years. There was no sign of interbreeding. The replacement theory seemed to be correct. But Pääbo and his team didn't stop there. Technology was improving at an incredible rate. They wanted to sequence the entire Neanderthal genome, not just the tiny mitochondrial part, but the main code, the 3 billion letters in the cell nucleus that make us who we are. It was a monumental task. The DNA in ancient bones is broken down into tiny fragments. It's contaminated with DNA from bacteria and from the people who handle the bones. It's like trying to reassemble a single book that has been shredded into a million pieces and mixed with a library full of other shredded books. For years, they worked on it. They developed new, ultra-clean methods for drilling into the bones and extracting the DNA. They created powerful computer programs to piece the fragments back together. Finally, in 2010, they did it. They published the first draft of the Neanderthal genome, and it contained a bombshell. They compared the Neanderthal genome to the genomes of various modern humans from around the world. And they found something that changed everything. People whose ancestors were from outside of Africa, Europeans, Asians, Native Americans, everyone had Neanderthal DNA. About 1 to 4% of their genome was of Neanderthal origin, but people from sub-Saharan Africa, whose ancestors never left the continent, had almost none. The conclusion was undeniable. Our ancestors had met Neanderthals and had children with them. It wasn't a myth. It wasn't a controversial fossil. It was written in the genes of billions of people alive today. The strict replacement model was dead. We didn't just replace them, we mated with them. This discovery opened up a whole new way of looking at the past. The geneticists could start to pinpoint where and when this mixing likely happened. The pattern Neanderthal DNA in all non-Africans' ancestry suggested that the interbreeding didn't happen in Europe. If it had, you would expect Europeans to have the most Neanderthal DNA, but people in China had it too, and so did people in Papua New Guinea. The simplest explanation was that the interbreeding happened shortly after Homo sapiens left Africa, but before they spread out and diversified across the rest of the world. The most likely place for this first contact was the Middle East. This region was a crossroads, and Neanderthals lived there, and modern humans had to pass through there to get from Africa to Asia and Europe. The skeletons of both Neanderthals and early modern humans have been found in caves in Israel, some dating back over 100,000 years. For thousands of years, the two populations may have ebbed and flowed in this region, their territories overlapping as the climate shifted. And it was here, probably somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 years ago, that at least some of our ancestors met their evolutionary cousins and produced children who survived and passed on their mixed heritage. So does this mean Neanderthals were simply absorbed? It's a big part of the answer. Absorption is a good word for it. It suggests a demographic process, not a single event. It wasn't like two equal tribes deciding to merge into one. The numbers were probably very lopsided. Think about it like this. A large wave of modern humans comes out of Africa. They are moving into territories occupied by smaller, more scattered groups of Neanderthals. Even if the mixing was rare, maybe it only happened occasionally at the frontier between the two populations, the effect would accumulate over time. A little bit of Neanderthal DNA would get introduced into the much larger human gene pool. In the next generation, that DNA would spread. Meanwhile, the Neanderthal population was likely already small and under stress. They lived in smaller groups than modern humans seem to. Their overall population was probably never very large. So, when a large incoming population mixes a little bit with a small native population, the native population's unique genetic signature gets diluted. It's like pouring a small cup of red paint into a giant bucket of white paint. You don't get a bucket of red paint, you get a bucket of light pink paint. Over generations, the distinct Neanderthal gene pool was swamped by the sheer number of modern humans. Their lineage didn't just end, it flowed into ours. They were genetically absorbed. What were these encounters like? We can only guess. Maybe they were peaceful. Perhaps two different hunting bands met, were curious about each other, and traded goods, stories, and eventually partners. The children could have been the result of raids or warfare. Maybe it was a mix of both, depending on the time, the place, and the specific groups involved. Human interactions are never simple, and there's no reason to think these were any different. The genetics also tells us something interesting about the children of these pairings. It seems that the interbreeding was at the very edge of biological compatibility. When scientists looked at where the Neanderthal DNA is located in our genomes, they noticed it's not randomly scattered. There are large deserts in our DNA with no Neanderthal contribution at all. One of these is the X chromosome. This is a classic sign that there might have been fertility problems. Specifically, it suggests that male hybrids, the sons of a Neanderthal father and a human mother, or vice versa, may have been less fertile or even sterile. This is a common phenomenon when two closely related but distinct species interbreed. It's called hybrid infertility. This means that the mixing might have been less efficient than we think. Many of the resulting pregnancies might not have been viable. Many of the hybrid children might not have been able to have children of their own. The Neanderthal genes that did make it into our gene pool were the ones that either didn't cause a problem or even gave us an advantage. The ones that were harmful were weeded out by natural selection over thousands of generations. So the absorption was a selective process. We kept the good bits and discarded the rest. But was absorption the whole story? Did they simply get absorbed? Almost certainly not. The fact that we interbred with them doesn't mean we didn't also compete with them. The disappearance of the Neanderthals was likely caused by a perfect storm of factors, and our arrival was just one part of it. First, there was the climate. The period when Neanderthals were disappearing, between about 45,000 and 40,000 years ago, was a time of extreme climate instability in Europe. The temperature could swing dramatically in just a few decades. Forests would turn into open steppes, and then back again. This would have been incredibly stressful for Neanderthals. They were adapted to a certain way of life, hunting large animals in familiar landscapes. When that landscape changed rapidly, their food sources may have become unreliable. Their populations, already small, might have fragmented and shrunk. Modern humans, coming from Africa, might have been more adaptable, with a more varied diet and more flexible social structures that could handle these rapid changes. Second, there was direct competition for resources. Both groups needed the best caves for shelter. Both groups hunted the same deer, horses, and mammoths. Even if there was no outright war, we were rivals. And Homo sapiens might have had a slight edge. Maybe our tools were a little better. A spear thrower, or atlatl, allows you to throw a spear with more force and from a greater distance than you can by hand. This makes hunting less dangerous and more efficient. There's good evidence modern humans had them, but the evidence for Neanderthals is much weaker. Maybe our social networks were larger. Modern hunter-gatherers often have connections with groups that are far away. This creates a safety net. If your local area is out of food, you can rely on relatives or allies a few valleys over. Neanderthal groups seem to have been more isolated. Their genetic diversity was low, suggesting they lived in small, inbred populations. When a crisis hit, they had nowhere to turn. Maybe we just had a slight demographic advantage. Some studies suggest that modern human mothers had a shorter interval between births than Neanderthal mothers. Even a tiny difference in birth rate, compounded over 1,000 years, can make one population grow and the other shrink into oblivion. We might have simply outbred them, and then there's the possibility of disease. When two long-separated populations meet, they often exchange pathogens. Modern humans coming out of Africa might have carried tropical diseases that Neanderthals had no immunity to. It could have worked the other way too. Neanderthals might have given us diseases we weren't prepared for. But given that the human population was expanding and the Neanderthal population was contracting, it's more likely they were the ones who suffered the most from new epidemics. So the final picture is not one of simple absorption. It's a picture of a long, slow decline for the Neanderthals, accelerated by the arrival of a new, numerous, and highly competitive human population. They were already struggling with a chaotic climate, their populations were small and isolated. Then we showed up. We competed with them for food and space. We may have brought new diseases. And in the midst of all this competition and pressure, we also occasionally interbred with them. The interbreeding was the final act. It wasn't a peaceful union that saved them. It was more like a last gasp of a disappearing people. Their population was shrinking, and as it did, the remaining Neanderthals were more likely to encounter modern humans than other Neanderthals. The mixing might have even accelerated their decline by introducing genes that cause fertility problems in their offspring. Slowly, over a few thousand years, their distinct populations winked out, one by one, across Europe. But they didn't completely vanish. They left a ghost in our machine. They left an echo in our DNA. What is that echo? What did we get from them? It turns out that the 1 to 4% of Neanderthal DNA isn't just junk. It does things. The genes we kept from them were often the ones that gave our ancestors an advantage as they moved into new environments outside of Africa. A lot of the Neanderthal DNA in modern humans is related to our immune system. This makes perfect sense. Neanderthals have been living in Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They had adapted to the local diseases and pathogens. When modern humans arrived, we were vulnerable to these new bugs. Interbreeding was a quick way to pick up some useful genetic tools. By getting a dose of Neanderthal immune genes, our ancestors got a ready-made defense system against local infections. It was an evolutionary shortcut. Other Neanderthal genes seem to influence our skin and hair. They affect the production of keratin, a protein that makes our skin, hair, and nails tough. These genes may have helped modern humans adapt to the colder, less sunny climates of the north. Thicker skin and hair could have provided better insulation. Changes in skin pigmentation could have helped with vitamin D production in regions with less UV light. But it's not all good news. Some of the Neanderthal DNA we carry is linked to modern health problems. Certain Neanderthal gene variants are associated with a slightly increased risk for things like type 2 diabetes, Crohn's disease, lupus, and depression. These traits might not have been a problem in a prehistoric environment, but in our modern world, with our modern diets and lifestyles, they can cause trouble. There is even a chunk of Neanderthal DNA that has been linked to a higher risk of severe symptoms from COVID-19. It shows that our ancient inheritance is still shaping our health today, for better and for worse. So, to go back to the original question, did Neanderthals simply get absorbed by humans? The answer is no, not simply. But their absorption into our gene pool was a crucial part of their story. They didn't just go extinct in the traditional sense. A species is only truly extinct when it leaves no living descendants. And Neanderthals did leave living descendants, billions of them. Anyone today with ancestry from outside of Africa is a living testament to the fact that Neanderthals are not entirely gone. They lost the evolutionary competition. As a distinct species or subspecies, they vanished from the planet. Their way of life, their culture, their language, it's all gone forever. But their biological legacy is woven into the fabric of our own humanity. They are a part of us. They are in our immune systems, in our skin, and in the complex workings of our brains. The story of what happened to them is really the story of what happened to us. It's a story of migration, of conflict, of adaptation, and of love and sex across the species barrier. It's a reminder that our own evolutionary path wasn't a straight line, but a complex, braided stream. We are not a pure species that replaced all others. We are ourselves hybrids. We are the product of ancient encounters on the plains and in the caves of a lost world. The Neanderthals didn't just disappear. A part of them survived in us.